Well, hello there. Welcome to the ASP.NET Community Stand-Up. Glad to have you folks back. It's the Aspire update that we've all been looking for. So excited. Yeah.
Howdy.
Mic check.
Just wanted to let you finish your intro.
I don't know. Yeah. It's I do my best. All right. I've got like 5 community links. So let's start with that. Yeah. I'm gonna give you all the time today. Okay, here's what we got. I'm going to be extra careful this time not to paste the StreamYard join link. I still can't believe I did that. A few weeks ago, I pasted the StreamYard join link into the chat. Yeah, it was beautiful. It was beautiful. Fortunately, James was watching, and he was like behind the scenes fixing it all. So
that's great.
Yeah, it was yeah, I'm a professional here. Okay, so I think I shared this last week. I'm not sure, but .NET 9 Preview 3 is out. So here's the stuff. This is the GitHub issue. Some neat stuff in like language runtime SDK stuff, and then also linked over to in the additional notes for the other workloads. So shared it last week. Just want to remind. This post, excited about this. This just went out yesterday. What we're doing here is we are going a little deeper on some of the features that we shipped in .NET 8. Yeah, that is cool, by the way. Johan calling out faster exceptions, and I've seen people like share about that, like significantly faster, which is pretty cool. Yeah, so we are doing a series of like stuff you can actually use today that shipped in .NET 8. So Rich has started a series on containers, and this one looking at container build. And wow, I just spilled coffee on my desk. Awesome. So walking through how to do that and inspecting what's in the image. And in this example, showing that like here he's using a very chiseled image, and it's not going to have time zone support. So then he goes through and looks at what's how to troubleshoot that. So that that's down in this part. And then how to add in specific stuff. So here bringing in time zone specific stuff. And then a pretty nice FAQ, like how does this compare to Docker-based images, etc. So very exciting. Be sure to give us feedback on these. And Rich is excited about cranking out more of these. So
cool.
Yeah. Speaking of which, up at the top of this post, there's a link to this upcoming event we've got. It's called Azure Developers.NET Day. So the idea of this event is a combo crossover of Azure services for .NET developers. So, really kind of like how to use this specific thing, or here's a new feature in whatever. So, yeah, going to be a fun thing coming up April 30th. All right, cool post from Khalid. This is just I always forget about this. I don't know if you folks like, there's responsive images is like, came out after my brain had already felt like HTML was done. And, you know what I mean? And I always forget about there's all this stuff like source sets and
it's too complicated for like normie people like me to understand now. Like now that I don't do this for a living, like, and there's very little tooling built into like the inner loop to help you with this. Like if you just have an image and there's like, well, do I have to go and create like more images now? And then I have to know how to write all this stuff. It's like the answer is yes. Or you have to use an entire client assets build pipeline to try and do this for you.
I'm waiting for an update to the tag helper pack. That's good.
Oh yeah. I think there is actually an issue logged there that's like, yeah, we should have a source set extension.
Yeah, it's something I'm reminded. I've been working on this update for this. So this main site we're using, the URL list, I've actually been rewriting it in Blazor with Colin, and so I'm like having to remember like some shipping production web app stuff, and it's like, oh yeah, minimal images sizes, and like finding out which images are actually displayed, and all that kind of stuff. It's exciting. Okay, speaking of just random like browser features, this one is cool. Andrew's starting a series here. He's looking at math and HTML. Again, another thing, I just felt like there's like a theme here of like browser supported features is MathML has actually been around for a long time.
Yeah.
And like, I don't know. So here, this one, he's actually just overviewing the feature. What is MathML? Introducing it, and I'm seeing more math lately, especially with like AI. I'm trying to learn more of AI internals, and there's unfortunately math involved. So this one, again, this is kind of intro hello world of the series, talking about how it works. He said later, towards the end of it, as he wraps up, talks about support. And then he says he's been using like MathJax and other JavaScript featured things, and didn't really find a NuGet package that supported MathML. So the cliffhanger, I believe, here is he's saying, he just kind of, he's going to show that in the next one. So stay tuned. That's this. It's got me hooked. I'm here for the series. All right. Last link to share. Just this was what I was reading. This is .NET Aspire in Preview 5. I think it's been since, I'm not even sure, Preview 3, I think we talked ish.
Sounds about right.
So, I mean, I'm not going to even try and summarize any of that. I'll just throw it over to you folks. Unless you want me to walk through the...
No, I mean, I think we could do it, right? If
yeah, I think so.
So I've been reading the chat, reading the comments. Yeah. I think one thing we have to figure out how to do, like, is not just talk about the update, but there seems to be a lot of like, what is Aspire still, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
Questions going on. So if anyone has any questions like about what Aspire is or about what it isn't, like feel free to put it in the chat as we try to explain what it is once more on this beautiful stream. So Aspire is we've been calling it a stack. It's a stack that is made to make you more productive building cloud native apps. Right, that's the intent. Aspire has a lot of technology that can be used for lots of things. So I think one pattern we're seeing is people are trying to figure out if I'm going to cloud, is Aspire for me, right? That's our primary scenario. There's a lot of tech that we built, the dashboard, the components, the orchestration that are usable outside of that one end-to-end scenario, which is cloud apps. But for the most part, Aspire can be used to build pretty much anything, right? So I think maybe it's worthwhile going through and showing like a super like hello world sample. Just I think all the examples we've shown up to this point at conferences, I think the NDC talk that me and Damian gave isn't actually on YouTube yet.
Is it still not? It's not.
I haven't seen it. I've seen the London talks, but not the ones for
yeah.
So let me screen share.
But yeah, the other way of summarizing that is when do we think Aspire starts adding value? As soon as you have more than one node in the logical map that is your application. So if you have like a web app that talks to a database, or a web app that talks to an API service, or a web app that talks to anything else, or a web app and then a worker app that like does something in coordination. Like as soon as you have more than one project that you deploy or more than one thing that is deployed, then Aspire is useful. Like that's kind of, and that's almost every, meaningful kind of app. So I thought, or at least I think every person has an app that is like that. So
sounds good.
Yeah.
Looks like you're at about 2 pixel size on your fonts.
Yeah.
There we go. Woo,
zoom all the way.
Yeah. Nice. Yeah, I mean, just to like echo that, I as a developer kind of observing and using Aspire, I'm finding that like just for the very simplest case of like app talking to an API or even just having a database, it's like having that dashboard and immediately having the launch URLs for everything, and like having like the instead of popping around 5 different terminal windows and like seeing what didn't start and all that, it's like transformed the dev experience for me.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And I think there is obviously like product intent. Like we built this thing to be for cloud native. So there is a streamlined experience to go from like dev to a cloud, but that's not the only scenario it can be used for. And I think what we're seeing is people seeing that angle and going, it isn't for me because I'm not going to Azure or I'm not going to Amazon's cloud, right? But for the most part, we think it is useful for building as Damian said, any app that has multiple things. It may be your app in a database, your app on a backend and a database and a cache. Once you have more than one thing, Aspire is useful, right? It's funny in the chat, Damian, you said Node in your graph. Someone thought you meant Node.js. So
it could be that as well.
It can be Node as well.
It could be. Yeah, language naming is terrible. Language sucks. Sorry.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow.
So I'm going to start off by just showing an even smaller hello world. So I'm going to go to File New to show you what I did, project. And since Aspire Preview 4, we've had a couple of new templates. If I search for Aspire here, I'll see Start Application, which has front end, a back end, and a cache. There's the Aspire Application, which has the Aspire Application host, which is used for orchestration locally. And then there's templates that are separate. So one of the very common questions we get is, can you use Aspire in your current projects, right? I have a big project, I have a big solution. I'm not greenfield. How do I add Aspire to it? And there's several ways of adding Aspire to your project. You can use one of these templates. You can use the tooling in Visual Studio. You can use
everyone's saying they can't see whatever you're talking about, but I don't know what they're referring to.
Yeah, I think you're sharing a mobile.
Oh, hold on. Did I only share?
You only shared.
Oh, hold on.
A window rather than your desktop.
Oh, oops.
Sneaky.
Entire screen. Ha 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 ha. There you go.
All right.
Better.
Back at you. Okay.
Better. Woohoo! So here. There you go.
All right.
So we have since Preview 4, if you missed kind of our updates, we now have more templates. The very first preview only had the starter application, which kind of has front end, back end, Redis cache as optional. And then this is an empty application, which just has the Aspire application host, which is used for orchestration. And then we have these new templates where you can kind of just add either the app host or service default, depending on what you want to consume. And then we have this actually brand new in Preview 5, this testing project, right? So you can add Aspire to any project. There isn't really, you don't have to make the app didn't have to be Aspire first. You didn't have to like come in with Aspire to begin with. You can just add the app host product to your current solution and start to like add projects piecemeal, right? So you don't have to kind of buy into the whole thing all at once. If it makes you nervous.
In fact, I think we should be, I've been thinking about this more. I think that should become the standard demo. The standard way that we show this is that we have an existing app. Maybe we need a version of Aspire Shop that doesn't have Aspire. Not eShop, not the huge one, because it's just too big to do in a demo, but something that's simplified without Aspire, and then show all the things you have to do to get that to work locally, and then say, now let's add Aspire to it and look at all the stuff it makes it simpler. Because I think there is a natural inclination from folks to go, oh, this is a new thing. I don't work on new things. I have this existing thing that I spend my 40 hours a week doing. I don't have time to assess, like we're never going to rewrite on a new framework, for example. And so people can balk at the idea of, we have this new thing for you that's going to make your life easier. It's like, no, this thing is very much modular. It's additive. Yes, you can start from scratch and live with it from day one, but you can add it to a thing that's been around for 15 years, assuming you've moved to core. Although even then, some people are trying to coordinate, orchestrate on their framework stuff with it.
The first demo we showed, right? When we were doing demos internally, was we took an app that just had a front end and a back end, and we did it by hand, and then we would add Aspire to it. That was our core demo, right? So the intent here is that it does work for any existing project.
Yeah, that was fun. I was James Montemagno's on a tour all over Europe this week and next week, and he was going through like a keynote with me last week, and we're going through that walkthrough. I think we made like a small update to the quick start like doc while we were doing that, but like but it is a really nice scenario where it's like, hey, I got a front end and back end. I could do this manually, or I can add this distributed app builder to it. Now I have service discovery, and now I've got like a dashboard, and I've got like in no work and very few lines of code, like I've improved my dev experience,
Yeah. So what I'll do is I will create what we don't normally show, right? So I'll start from the app host project, and the app host project is this new type of project in Aspire, I should say. It's not just tied to VS. It's VS Code, the CLI, that all works just fine. So I'm making this what we're calling the app host, and the app host is where you orchestrate your overall application.
It's a console app. Like we should call that out, right? Like if you're a .NET person, this is just a console app. It's just that you're calling in through the Microsoft.extensions.hosting sort of pattern. So there's a new hosting builder, distributed application hosting builder versus an application hosting builder or a web application hosting builder. That's the same pattern. This is a new scenario where we're defining a host for a distributed application, but it's just a console app that's going to like run when you run this.
That's right. And so normally you see this code with like adding projects, adding containers. This just runs by itself. So I'm going to control F5 just this part. And I'm on preview 6, which you don't have yet, which is we're still like trying to finish it off. But this is your experience, right? You get this dashboard and it will show you stuff that you have orchestrated. And it also has console logs and then the open telemetry logs. So you get this default experience for local dev for all these things, right? That's kind of how you should see this project. This project is your local orchestration project used to model parts of your application or the entire thing, right? So now I can do something like, what's funny is we did a bunch of refactoring, so know that there's things missing, right? But if I do add, you'll see a bunch of things in here like add container, add executable, add parameter, add project. These are kind of the primitives of the system. So you can add a project. This is a .NET project. You can add an executable. This could be Node or Ruby or whatever you want to add on the command line. You can add a container. And when you add these to your app host, they will be booted up, orchestrated, show up in the dashboard. So this is kind of the low level way you kind of compose your application, right? So
and we can even just to like dive in a little bit further, if you want to boil it down to its absolute essence, even a project is based on the executable. So the actual primitives are even lower than this list.
Right.
Like really all there is
just two.
You can do an executable, you can do a container, and then we have these new ones like connection string and these weird ones that are like inputs and outputs, parameters. So that's kind of the new third one that you can orchestrate, but they don't run, right? They're more about shifting data between different nodes. Again, I'll use that word again. Different resources that you've composed together. Yeah. So project is just a layer above because we're .NET. So we have a primitive for .NET that's built an executable. But as Fowler said, you can run a Node app or a Ruby app. And as it turns out, we actually have a package that makes it easy to add a Node app. And guess what? It just built on top of that add executable method. Just added some more extension methods and added a couple more types because it's all just C#.
So the container one is the one that feels the most magic. Like I get running an executable and like I get, like container one. And now container doesn't just require Docker, like it works with Podman too.
So it's funny, like even a container from an orchestration point of view, ultimately that's going to boil down. When you run it, you're just running an exe because you run Docker run. Or something, right? Like ultimately, that's all they ever had. Now, behind the scenes, we actually do preserve the fact that it's a container because we're shelling out to another component, this thing called DCP, which you may have heard us say a couple times in the past, which is actually the thing that's orchestrating, and it knows what a container is, and so it does that separately. But yeah, like there's a concept of a container because a container runtime is a concept, and there are specific rules and contracts about how containers run, how you have to declare networking for containers, what the container is based on. You have an image name that has tags and that has a repository. Like there's all these things that suddenly come into the model once you start talking about a container. And so that's the only reason, that's the reason that exists as a separate thing. But as you said, it's abstract. Like it's not Docker, it's container. And then you need a container runtime to run the container. It just so happens that Docker is the one that sort of started everything. But now people use Podman. There are a couple of other ones as well that are much lower usage.
Those two are the most common.
Yeah, Docker and Podman are very
lower level things are not really usable.
Yeah.
I don't know. There's some sort of jokes going on about DCP, and I don't know.
I think we could talk about it. So let's talk about it in context though. So I'll create a project, right? I'll add a project. That is my favorite template, the empty project, which has nothing in it. and it has this enlist and aspire orchestration project. And that tooling just does this magic where it adds this line of code to my app. And it also will add a project reference to my project, right? So my app host project references this Aspire hosting app host package, and it references the project that I'm going to orchestrate. Now, this reference is kind of magic. We do some sleight of hand to not make it a real reference, but all it does is it's giving you a nice way to reference the path to the project, right? You don't want to have to hard code like dot slash blah 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 dot cs proj, right? Like this is not nice to do. So all this type is doing is this type gives you a strongly typed class so you can get a handle on that project, right? So this is like what it does. There's the code gen. We at build time figure out the path to CS proj, and we have this like fake type, and all it does is it represents the path to that project, right? Super simple.
Wait, I'll ask the dumb question. What did you just do to switch between those?
You mean this?
To show the code gen, yeah. Or are you
F12.
doing F12? Okay.
Yeah, so I did this F12 and this type.
Right.
And this is like this our code gen that spit out this class, so you don't have to like hard code the path to this web application, right? So now I have in my app one thing being orchestrated, and this might look pointless, but like it's actually pretty interesting. So I'll boot this up, I'll launch it, and it will just show this. So what happened, right? We added a project, and somehow you got it launched. It has a state it's running. It has a start time. It has this source, which is our CS proj, and it has these endpoints. Where'd these come from, right? I can launch the app, and the app is running. Hello world, right? So this is the app is functional now. So what Aspire does is we have each resource. I should say, like, it might seem like Aspire is doing all this stuff, but Aspire just has a model for creating resources, and the project resource will read the launch profile, which is a very like .NET thing. So my app has this launch settings. When you call add project, we will read these launch settings and harvest these URLs, and we configure the equivalent of, you know, we represent whatever is in this launch profile in the Aspire model for launching that project. So for example, we have a core environment is development that can be represented in the app host in a certain way. But when you call add project, we kind of automate reading from launch settings and making it map to the Aspire model. So when you launch in Aspire, it works end to end, right? One of the things Aspire does that is unique is it has IDE integration. So unlike, you know, you could use Compose, or you could use other ways to manually run different projects, and they're all kind of cumbersome. So when I F5 this project, the app host project, Aspire will auto attach to all my like orchestrated projects. So if I hit F5, I'm in the debugger in my application. And this is super useful when trying to debug apps that have multiple projects. You often have to either attach to multiple or run a subset or run some. The Aspire app host gives you a single entry point that kind of like fans out to multiple apps. And you can kind of attach and set breakpoints in any of the applications as part of an end-to-end flow. So it makes that easier. And there's a first-class protocol between, you know, our orchestration process and IDEs. Like JetBrains implements this protocol to make debugging work. So does VS and VS Code actually in Preview 5.
Okay. So we've got some questions coming in. Do you mind if I run through?
I want to answer some stuff about the launch profile stuff, because
I was like this
very
one
vocal
here
about how all that worked when we designed it. So launch profiles have been around since before .NET Core, since it was .NET.
The dawn of time,
right? It was something that we built very, very early on. Launch settings.json is the file that exists under your properties directory inside your project that contains these launch profiles. They are a development time only thing, right? They're only there to support the tooling experience when you're developing, during the developer in a loop. Like you want a .NET run, it'll use a launch profile. It'll find one by default, picks the first one, right? Or you can specify which one you want to launch with by passing an argument. Visual Studio, there's a selector box up the top. Next, you can see on Fowler's screen, the green arrow. Those two things there are launch profiles. And it just so happens that since .NET 6, we've created HTTP core projects with 2 launch profiles, one called HTTPS and one called HTTP. And you can probably guess why they're called that, because one enables HTTPS and the other one doesn't. When it comes to Aspire, the project primitive, as Fowler just said, it'll pick a launch profile by default. It uses that to figure out, well, what port am I going to use to launch this .NET project with, if you even have a launch profile. You can also set things like environment variables in launch profiles, and you can have as many launch profiles as you like. They're just nodes inside. I keep using that word. They're just entries inside the launch settings.json file. Now, the app host project itself has launch profiles because it's just another .NET project. It's a console app, as I said before, and you can have launch profiles. So look, in here we have launch profiles for the app host project, so that when you run it, this context gets created as part of launching the project. You can see an application URL, you can see the environment variables that get set, and they're underneath the names of these, HTTPS and HTTP. What the app host project will do is it will try to match the launch profile name. So if you launch the app host with HTTPS as the launch profile, it's just a name. You can call it whatever you like. That's just what we chose to call it. It will, by default, look for a launch profile of that name in any .NET project that you add with add project. And it will launch that project with that same named launch profile. If it doesn't find one with that name, it'll fall back to using the first launch profile of that project that it finds. Or you can just specify which one you want when you call add project. So Fowler, if you go back to the program CS, you can show that when you add project call, you can pass another parameter, which is, I want to launch this one with this other launch profile. And so the advantage of this is you can create whatever launch profiles you like. You can set them up with the names you want. You can set them up with the environment variables that you want, which also includes things like the concept of .NET environment. So we have this hosting primitive called environment name, and then we use that to do things like, if you're in development, do this. If you're in production, do that. And you can create whatever environments you like. It's extensible. So you could create your own environments. You can create your own build configurations. All the usual pivots that you have available to are still available to you. And you can use those to customize all of this any way that you like.
Okay.
Right. So you can pick launch profiles. You can turn off launch profiles and say, I want to override, not have any launch profiles. Give me random ports. And then you can define all the endpoints here. Like I want an HTTP endpoint as like, I don't know. This will create a random endpoint with a random port. With a random
but the
name.
launch profile system itself does not support random ports. That's not a primitive it has. The way it works today is that the templates are authored so that when you create a new project, it is the template engine assigns a random port into the launch profile, the launch settings.json file, based on how the template was authored. Like the template says, oh, give me a random port between 16,000 and 16,300 for this value right here, this environment variable or whatever it might be. So, but there's no way in a launch profile to say, I just want a random port inside this URL. It's not something it natively supports. But as Fowler's showing, you can override things in Aspire. So in Aspire, you can add a project and then you could say, yeah, it's going to use the launch profile by default, but then you can override the HTTP endpoint that gets added and you can set its port to null, which in Aspire means generate me a random port here.
Okay.
That works. Look at that. On the fly.
It's all about layers. So
that was fancy. Good question then, huh?
So maybe the important thing to understand isn't just kind of what Aspires do. I mean, it's me and Damian, so we're gonna go into like details that you don't care about. But I think the important thing to understand is we spent the last 2 previews basically trying to make sure everything was kind of sound, the actual like design. So when you add a launch profile, all you're doing is mapping the .NET file to the Aspire primitives. Then you can override things. Then you can create. So if you want to create your own model, and you get how that works, you should be able to kind of say, okay, Aspire is going to read the launch profile and produce this data set. I can change it and I can mutate the underlying model by understanding how it works, and then I can kind of tweak it, right? So I'm seeing questions around, can I add X to Aspire? Like for the most part, you probably can, because once you understand how the model works and how we map things to like run and execute and launch, you should be able to kind of make your own resources, right? That do the same thing.
Yeah. So one question that's come up that's a little bit like on the edge of that is a few people asking about like .NET framework.
So I will show something, and this is on
Yeah.
the live stream. So no one tell anyone. This is a secret, top secret, right?
Okay.
So the question is like, can I launch or can I orchestrate? What do we have? What's the thing I should use here? Like a empty.
Do you even have the ASP.NET templates installed?
I don't even know. I'm
They're not
checking out
added by
like
default, I
.NET
think.
framework.
You have to specifically add them.
I must have it.
Only if you added them. They're not in the default VS installation anymore.
I'm
The web
pretty
workload
sure I
doesn't
had to
include them, I
debug
think.
someone's code at some point.
Well,
ASP.NET,
it's only the templates. You have all the other stuff,
.NET.
right?
I seem to have console, but not ASP.NET.
Yeah, because there's two different workloads in VS. There's the client applications workload or desktop applications, and then there's a web one.
Okay, so here's like an app that does not have top level statements, which burns my eyes. Just so you know,
So much like redundant
so
code.
much stuff there. Right. Hello from .NET framework. And thread.sleep because like who needs tasks? 5 seconds, right? Okay. Maybe I'll add a date in here. Can I even use string interpolation? I don't even know if I can use string interpolation on .NET. I'll leave it. Let's do this for now. Old school.
It'll say
Okay,
like
so this is
string.
this is my app. This is my app, right? So I'm gonna attempt to add a reference from my app host project.
All right.
To this console app, and it worked. And then I'm gonna do builder add projects dot console app one.
Nothing has stopped you so far. Like we didn't block it.
NetFX. So I have 2 apps, and I should be able to launch this now. And will it work? Will it work? So it seems to work. Like app is running, right? NetFX app is running. Logs, do the console logs work? Maybe, maybe not. There you go.
Wow, look at that. Okay.
So this works. This is functional. It works in full VS only. You won't get Aspire components. You won't get all the other features. You can orchestrate and run. You can't do much else. So you don't get you don't get all of Aspire, right? So we're not going to retarget our packages that only run on .NET 8 to run on .NET Framework. That's not.
This is a really interesting point because like this is one of those samples or demos where you've just laid bare, I think, the contract between when we say you would compose a project into the app host and we say that's a .NET project. There's no .NET level compiler reference between the project and the app host because the app host is running .NET 8, right? Like so you can't reference that from .NET Framework. Exactly. So the contract here is just it's a project from what you said before, IDE integration. That's like the big difference here. Well, VS has a concept of a project and Rider has a concept of a project because .NET does. And we integrate with that. And now a project could be an old project, .NET Framework, or it could be a new project, CPS, .NET Core project. And we made sure that when we did that work, we didn't go further than the pure definition of what a project is. Now I'm hand waving a lot, but like this is, I think, very important to understand as we talk more and more about the pieces of Aspire and the pieces of the experience. It is so, I mean, Hanselman says this all the time, like going one layer lower to really just get a better appreciation of how things are working will make you, 100 times better of a developer. And this is a great example because when it gets to the point where we start talking about like configuration injection and stuff like that, it looks magical. But if you just go one layer below, it's just really rudimentary stuff that we're doing for you that you would have done anyway, but we're just doing it for you by default. And then when you understand how it's working, you go, oh, this isn't .NET specific. It's not even Visual Studio specific. It's not Windows specific. It's not anything specific. I'm just like setting environment variables or I'm just reading JSON files. Like it's really, really low level universal primitives that we very carefully think about and argue about and get wrong and then change and then get right in subsequent previews to make sure that these things layer together in a way that makes them extensible and kind of look like they were always meant to be together and they only work together, but they don't only work together. You can pull them apart and they continue to work and you can put them back together in different ways. And that's what architecture is to me. That's when we talk about architecting systems versus just like coding and development. And that's kind of the hard work that we try to do when we build these end-to-end experiences. So this is
Okay.
an example of that.
There's a
Well, we're
flurry
getting-
of questions. I think
tons of questions. Do you want to go questions, or do you want to? Because I also wanted to give you time to show any update stuff you want to show too.
it's
Your
hard
choice.
to show updates when people are asking like questions. I think
So there's a lot
Okay.
of fundamental
Help their
questions still,
understanding,
right?
right?
People are asking the same, like,
yeah.
do I deploy
Yeah.
the- So we should
So
really talk about
Suggestion would be I would let's answer some questions directly.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
then go back to the sample and then kind of run through like
Okay.
more of these things.
So I'll just pick some, and you can
pick some.
can pass or whatever. JetBrains support. I think you mentioned some sort of writer integration.
Yes,
You
it
said
works
something-
already.
Yeah.
There's actually a really good tooling plugin built by the JetBrains team for Aspire.
Nice.
Let me pull it up. JetBrains, what's it called? JetBrains Writer.
And while you're mentioning like working with other ecosystems, like I saw there's also AWS support in recent
In Preview 5, yeah, it's
Preview
brand
5.
new. It is very, very cool.
Very cool.
So, there's a
Making
first class
on one stream
plugin. Yeah, that's it's actually a really good plugin
Cool.
for Writer, which is pretty awesome.
Okay. Okay. I'm gonna try and rip through questions here. When will there be Preview 5 packages?
for
So here's the
.NET
problem.
9 specifically.
Oh,
yeah, so here's the problem. Like Aspire is shipping targeting .NET 8.
yeah.
So when we say Preview 5, Preview 6, Preview, whatever preview we're at, that is the .NET 8 version.
No, that's the Aspire preview.
Sorry, that's the
for
Aspire
.NET
preview
8.
version for 8. We're also shipping .NET 9 previews. So whenever those ship, we snap the latest Aspire version to whenever that shipped. And if an Aspire version comes out after a preview of .NET 9, we don't go to patch that version. So you're going to get .NET 9 Preview 4 at some point, and that will have the newest Aspire at that point in time.
Just
So right
for
now-
full transparency, like we are not thinking about .NET 9 at all. Like
At
no
all.
one on the Aspire team is thinking about .NET 9 right now. I don't run .NET 9. All the demos we're doing are .NET 8 based Aspire demos because we're marching towards releasing Aspire, the first
Right.
version that runs on .NET 8. So the .NET 9 version of Aspire that's being shipped as the .NET 9 previews go out, it's basically just completely automated. Like no one's really looking at that. So if you're looking at Aspire and evaluating it, use .NET 8 would be my suggestion right now.
Good point. Good point.
Okay.
Next question. Rapid fire.
All right,
rapid fire.
next question. Okay, a few people saying like, how's this relate to Ty? What's the quick answer?
Ty's
on
the
that?
granddaddy.
Ty is dead and Aspire is alive. Ty was the experiment that formed a lot of the basis for how we ended up going to Aspire. So if you're thinking about Ty, the repo has I think an issue that kind of says the Ty experiment is over, and if you're looking for the future of Ty, go to Aspire.
Right.
Mhm. And I mean, as a Ty like diehard, I absolutely
fan.
love Ty. I'm a huge fan of Aspire. Like everything I loved about Ty is like this is level 2 here in Aspire. So, is Aspire only solution context, or you can? I think you kind of said you can hook it up to anything, but like
This
solution.
is a good
level-
question though.
Good question.
This is something that was asked on the first day,
First
preview.
day, yeah.
And we had a issue log that I had a bunch of like suggestions of various patterns that people could use to, if you're in a larger set of teams or they're distributed teams and you need to like compose together different things. We assumed that there would be patterns that emerge, and we sort of threw out 3 or 4 to start with. And Fowler actually said last week to me or yesterday, he's been talking with folks on the Discord channel, and people are now starting to create their own patterns, which is great, which is what we wanted. That was one of the advantages and one of the goals of using C# for the app host, is that people could extend it and they could come up with patterns. And so based on how we're seeing that happen, we have very, very early thoughts about how we might codify some of those patterns into the product in a subsequent version of Aspire, so that there's more first class support for, hey, I've got 17 teams, they all own their own microservice, but we want to have a first-class way of composing, and they're all in their own repos, but we want a first-class way of composing all those services together into different cohorts so that we can run them as like subgroups when we're doing local development. How do we do that with Aspire? Do I have multiple app host projects? Do I have multiple solutions? Do I have to have submodules in my Git repo? Like, how do I do that? So those are things that you can manually kind of do today, as I said, if you just kind of like choose a pattern and go with it. But it'll almost always require you to choose a pattern based on how you do things already, or to change how you do what you're doing already a little bit in order to fit one of the patterns. Just because that's the nature of inner loop development. What do I mean by that? It's like, well, if you clone a repo and then are used to opening something in VS or in VS Code or Writer and hitting F5, that assumes you have all the code, because like if you're hitting F5 and cloning, it means you have the code and you're going to build it. But some teams don't work like that. They depend on some other team's service, and they don't build that service because it's written in a different language or it uses a different version of .NET or whatever it might be. So how do I compose that team stuff in? Well, should I use a submodule, or should I use a container that they publish? If it is, how do I find that container? Because it's on some internal registry, or so on. Like, it gets complicated really, really quickly, which is why there are like N patterns, and why I think we'll end up with maybe new features in Aspire that map to various patterns that people have. So the short answer is yes, but it's a very long and complex answer for depending on the situation of your actual, team A, team B situation.
Okay. All right. Had a few questions on integration with other, like here, Dapper and Orleans. How do those work together?
Oh,
they do.
So
we should move on. They do. So this is a good one because we actually have first class support for Dapper and first class support for Orleans. And it's really first class. The Dapper support was added by the Dapper team, and the Orleans support was added by the Orleans team. But yeah, I just want to I'm actually kind of surprised at how many people. I think we are struggling with this message. Like, the company Microsoft has lots of groups that do developer focused stuff as well as developer division. There's other groups as well. And people see these things and they immediately say there's so much overlap. I don't see the overlap, but it's probably because I know a lot more about each of these things, and I'm not just looking at like one talk or one marketing thing. And so I keep having to remind myself it's actually really difficult to have, like, you need a certain level of understanding before you can see the big picture about why all these things aren't the same. And the overlap is actually quite small in a lot of cases, and they do fit together well. And if you zoom out to the whole cloud native ecosystem, not just Microsoft, it's even worse, right? Like obviously there's like 27 things that completely overlap, and how would you ever choose? But even within Microsoft, yes, I acknowledge that there are some things that kind of look similar. But yeah, Fowler, have a go at explaining.
I think there's the answer, and then there's what people want to hear.
Yeah.
I think these questions lead me down the path of people want to hear which one to use.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
You're never going to get that answer from me personally, like which one to use. There are many options, and you have to know what you get out of the tech. And we can give you really good explanations as to how they interop and where the benefits are in each one. And I can give you my opinion, like, but you're never gonna get the official Microsoft stance on like you are supposed to use technology X only, right? Orleans is really great for virtual actors. Like, if you have that scenario, you should use Orleans, right? And I would even say, even over Dapper actors, use Orleans actors if you're in .NET.
Yeah,
that's what you use, right? Dapper is really great when you have multiple languages, right? It doesn't have an opinion about what language you use. The sidecar works for anything, and that's kind of where it is best, right?
You want a universal model that boils down some of these concepts to one thing, abstracts that away, and then you can plug it in with all the native language support and framework support that they've added. Like, that's what it does, and does really well.
Right. Aspire orchestration specifically works with both of those concepts. Aspire does not attempt to abstract the cloud. Aspire works with whatever client libraries you have, whatever existing systems you have. That's why it's possible for the Dapper team to build a Dapper resource in the Aspire app model and have it work with the Dapper SDK in the applications, right? So you can think of Aspire as a framework that kind of provides you the ability to write code on both sides of this stack. Like, one is in your app and the other is in your infra, right? So we've never had a system that let you build a framework that kind of spanned both parts of the stack. Normally you would write a framework that kind of lives in your application tier. Now you can write code that lives in your infra. That's kind of like the innovation, right? That's the big change. So Dapper has Dapper and Orleans kind of can now say, when you're going to use me in local dev, use this resource or this method, and it will configure all of my sidecars. It will configure all the things required to make the app run, right? It's really simple when all your app is doing is talking to a backend API or database, because they're built-in client libraries, and there's no requirements on the infra being a certain way or launching processes. When you have that requirement, Aspire gives you this benefit because those frameworks can kind of add first-class support for launch a Dapper sidecar for every project. Do you know how hard that is to do, like locally? When people that use Dapper today, like it's really insane to me to watch people run the command, because it's like 15 arguments and you're passing in ports and like addresses and flags, and I'm like, this looks insane to me. People are doing it, right? Aspire makes it all go away. Like you literally don't have to mention any ports, because we can read ports from the model and figure things out. So you should use both together if you have those in your application.
Okay, cool. Let me see. Just related, and maybe it's the same answer, but what about Radius?
Oh, that's a really good one.
Yeah, it's a good one. So Radius was announced, unfortunately for us, at basically the exact same time that Aspire was announced. And so there was understandably yet another example of like these things both on the surface. If I've just seen it for 10 seconds, they sound like they're solving the same thing. Cloud native development, distributed application, Radius is essentially cloud agnostic infrastructure as code. Okay, so like if you think of like in Azure, we have this thing called Bicep, which is a language that you write to author out all your infrastructure. It is an infrastructure as code language for writing and defining all the Azure resources that you want to deploy with more than just static. Like, you know, you can declare inputs and outputs and variables effectively and do things like that, right? It has constructs that let you do.
I just have to say, it took me a long time to figure out. I think I'm right about this, that Bicep is a joke on ARM.
It is.
Yes.
It is.
Like, so ARM is kind of the core primitive, right? Like ARM is the lowest possible level Azure Resource Manager or whatever it stands for. And then there are ARM endpoints, which are the endpoints that your tools hit to like create things and all the rest of it. And that's like the language that all of the Azure.
ARM is the IL. If you want an analogy,
ARM is the IL, I guess. Yeah, or even the assembly, like, to be honest.
Bicep compiles to ARM.
And then you've got Bicep that compiles to ARM, right? And so think of Radius as cross-platform Bicep. That's an easy way to think about it. Yeah. But it's not just that, because it has some bits that you have to run. Like it has an agent that runs inside the target, right? Just like to have Bicep do anything in Azure, something has to like accept your Bicep and then like run it, right? Like which compiles down to ARM basically, and then the ARM endpoints do it and all the rest of it. So there is an intelligent live thing running that understands your radius, right? So that you can give it operations and say, deploy this radius. And that means you have a thing called a deployment. Well, what version is that? He has to understand. And that's when the whole snowball of all the primitives and concepts then come on top of that. So that's what radius is. It's a way to generalize in the same way that Dapper is generalizing an application model for wiring up different parts of a distributed applications and having them talk to each other. Radius is abstracting all the infrastructure stuff, like how do I deploy 3 databases and 4 compute nodes and a storage thing and oh, that's funny. It's that layer, right? So I guess the other way of putting it, we call it control plane and like data plane. Is that what we call it internally? I can't even remember now.
Yeah, control plane and data plane.
Control plane. So like Radius is the control plane, right? And then Dapper is the
data plane. That's right.
Data plane, right? It's the thing that's running. It's your actual app that's running and doing compute. The control plane is the thing that controls deploying your app and making sure it's alive and like scaling it up to 7 nodes if more traffic comes in. Like that's the lower level infrastructure bit. So hopefully that analogy kind of helps people understand the different layers these things exist at.
Okay. A few more questions here. Several people asking about customizing visualization in the dashboard in Aspire.
Not yet.
Not yet.
No.
I love, by the way, I want to get James on to show more of like how the work he's done on that. I mean, and I know it's a team, but like the whole dashboard being running in Blazor, and it's using Fluent UI.
Yeah, the Fluent UI and a few other things as well. But yeah, that's the major UI control library it's using.
It's
Very cool.
worthwhile having a show about the dashboard only, just because it is built in .NET with our tech, with all of our stuff. We add support for authentication in .NET in preview 5 and 6. So there's like sprinklings of the
Using all the
OIDC
things.
stuff. We have custom auth handlers. So it's a good example of kind of using all of our tech that we built to build something, right?
Yeah.
And we ship it as a container.
As a container.
Yeah,
it's like shipping a white. In the old days, we call that a white box product. Like you ship a pre-packaged thing that you can then apply your own branding or apply your own customizations to. But obviously, in the container world, this is just like normal. Like people, but the Postgres container ships with a list of environment variables you can set to change how it behaves, right? But it's a generic image. The dashboard is very similar, and over time, as we add features, the container image will get more configurable. You'll be able to like mount a volume or a bind mount, and then we'll find things in there and load them and do stuff. I don't know. I'm just making stuff up now, but like you can certainly imagine how we would support customization and extending the dashboard to do other things.
Okay. Several people asking about so Node, Ruby, telemetry specifically, so that's just OTel, right?
We have a sample. So in the samples repo, the original Node app sample, which we added before we even had first-class Node support in Aspire, actually goes to the trouble of configuring OTel for Node, which I have to say is not fun, and the documentation is not great, and was a lot of head banging on desk kind of stuff. And I recently had to fix it all because it was broken. It shows, like it's just an OTel endpoint. So as long as you've configured your app in your language to do whatever you need to do in that stack to emit open telemetry, and you point it at the OTel endpoint that the dashboard is hosting, then it works, the OTLP endpoint. The advantage of the .NET stack is we're doing it all for you. In the .NET world, the whole promise of Aspire is not only does the dashboard host an OTLP endpoint to push all the data to, the Aspire components turn on and bring in all the open telemetry stuff for the underlying client library that the component is representing. So if you're using the Aspire component for Redis, then it brings in all the open telemetry stuff for Redis for .NET. If you're using the Aspire component for Postgres, it brings in all the open telemetry stuff and it turns it on. And then we have this service defaults project there's a template for, which Fowler will get to, that sets up all the open telemetry stuff, brings in those packages and shows how to configure metrics and logs and traces and things for you. So again, it's that whole left-hand, right-hand thing. There's like the dashboard is about showing what's already been configured, right? It's showing, and it is not .NET specific in any way. It just happens to be written in .NET, but the contract to feed information into the dashboard, whether it's the list of resources, the logs, the OTel metrics, none of that is .NET specific, not even remotely .NET specific. It's just gRPC endpoints, scraping like log files off disk behind the scenes, pushing them over a gRPC endpoint, and it's OTLP, which is the Open Telemetry Protocol over gRPC. So like it's literally just all standard non.NET stuff. Anything can plug into it. But if you're using
frustrated, by the way, I'm frustrated that it's OTLP because every time I read OTLP, I want to spell correct it to OLTP. And no, you had to do it.
So yeah, the answer is yes, you can do that.
Okay. Good. I got one more question, and then I want to turn it back over to anything else you want to show. Few people asking about different, like for instance, David Pine asking about desktop apps, other people asking about WinForms apps. Like, is there a non-web client story?
So we have a sample for that as well. That was one of the ones I added very early on. So there's a client app sample in the samples repo. And if you don't know what the samples repo is, it's github.com/.net/aspire-samples, like hyphen. There's a client apps sample. It has a WinForms app and a WPF app in it. And I think there was even a WinUI app at some point. I'm not sure that we accepted that one. Just to show that, because they're just projects, they'll just get launched when you hit F5 and you can inject environment variables in there and they can talk to endpoints that are API projects and all that just works just fine. I know that there are folks on the Maui team who are looking and have experimented with how could we integrate Maui? Because that's a really interesting scenario. A lot of client apps want to talk to a back end. over HTTP, and often you own that back end and you want to develop, doing the inner loop both. And so they're very interested in how to make that all work well together. There's no first class, like out of the box, like it just works stuff yet, but they're looking at how we could productize some of that. But you can kind of cobble it together today, the same way Fowler showed you with the .NET Framework project. Client apps are just like super complicated because especially when you get to things like Maui, because you've got emulators and lots of different configurations and things that you have to think about. And the emulators bring in other restrictions. So like the Android emulator, if you want to talk outside the emulator, it only supports HTTPS and like things like so things get really complicated really quickly. Things like networking, like localhost, doesn't work in the emulator because localhost is the emulator, not the machine you're trying to talk to, right? So like it gets harder very quickly.
Okay. Let me see. I think Fowler wanted to take one other one here.
Yeah.
Can I deploy Aspire on IIS to use my domain as an endpoint?
So I will answer this question first, but then I want to go back and explain why that's the answer. So no, and because the app host is for development only. This thing that we are showing you is for development. This does not run on your servers. It does not get deployed. It does not exist anywhere past your dev machine. Like if there's one thing to take away from this 1 hour conversation, it is that orchestration is for local development. Like that is the thing you have to remember, right? So even though you're sitting down modeling your application, when you run it or you hit F5 or you run locally, this support, this like thing that runs multiple things is only supported for local development. You can't deploy it. You can't run it on your servers. Don't publish it. It's not supported, right? That's the summary. Now, if you're thinking about being able to use some of the pieces, there's no system. Now, we haven't built any system to make like deploying the dashboard or like all the pieces of Aspire work, but you could conceive taking the dashboard, running it on your II server, and sending telemetry to that thing. So you aren't running the Aspire orchestrator, but you can use the Aspire dashboard to show telemetry in your current systems. So when people ask questions like, can I deploy Aspire? Like that's a super loaded question because like yes and no and yes and no.
Not specific enough.
Depending on which parts you mean. Aspire is like 5 things. So be cognizant of kind of like the breadth of that question. And when people say Aspire isn't for deployment or is for deployment, it's really hard to give a straight answer because it depends on what you mean, right? Like yes, it's for deployment, but not orchestration. You like the way it works is a different way. It's not like by taking this software and having it exist on your IIS servers and having it launch your like that's just not what we think of as deployment, right? So
okay,
you can't deploy it to your IIS server and like that's not a thing, right?
But then as that as a foundation, we should talk about, well, then how do we do deployment? Because obviously we've added all this amazing information to the app host that describes your application, all the pieces. It would seem like a complete wasted opportunity to not use that in any way to aid deployment. And so, yeah, this question that comes up, yes, it would make lots of sense to make your app model, which is what you define in your app host, somehow exportable or translate to where you want to deploy the application to outside of running locally on the developer bot. And that's exactly how it works. So we do have a deployment story and we do have a deployment approach or pattern, and it's based on extracting the information out of the app host, that application model, and then translating that into, or having some other tool chain consume that information and then do the deployment, right? And so, for example, the Azure Developer CLI or AZD is what we've deeply integrated with in the first release, which allows you to very, very easily point AZD at your Aspire solution, like at the source code, and say, deploy this. And it will discover it. It goes, oh, it's Aspire. Oh, I know how to orchestrate or automate the deployment of Aspire. It looks at the app host project. It instructs it to generate what's called a manifest of itself. And then it takes that manifest and it transforms it effectively into bicep is the way to think about it. And then on top of that, it gets even crazier because the reason it's hard to talk about these things is there's actually a lot. Like Fowler said, it's 5 things, but each one of those 5 things then explodes into 20 things. And so it's a huge cognitive load to try and explain all this in 1 hour. It's just too much. So, but AZD and the bicep, which we talked about, you can actually model bicep into your app host. So not only can you add executables and containers and projects and parameters, you can add bicep. There's an aspire.hosting.azure package that teaches Aspire hosting what bicep is, and then models it into the lower level primitives. So it now becomes part of your app model, so that when you F5 running locally, it can actually provision Azure resources to use during development, or it can connect to an existing Azure resource and then download connection information and use that to configure your ASP.NET Core project so that you can connect to it, right? And then when it comes to deployment time, or what we call publish time, when you publish the app host, you can go, oh, you've got Azure stuff in here. So like, let me emit the bicep for you. And like AZD will use that, right? And so that's the model that we kind of use. And then AWS has had support for their infrastructure as code, Cloud Foundry and those type of things. And then there's someone, obviously I've talked about Kubernetes. There's a tool called Aspirate, which was built by someone in the community, which does the exact same thing, but does it for Kubernetes. And so you run this Aspirate tool, you point it at your Aspire solution, and then it deploys to Kubernetes, right? Deploys your whole Aspire out to Kubernetes, or it deploys to Docker Compose. You can give it a little switch and say, no, I want you to output a Docker Compose file. And then you can Docker Compose up the whole thing basically. And now your .NET apps are running in containers, and everything else that you would specify is running in containers too. And the whole point is it's pluggable, right? There's what is there in the box, what can it do? But the real value isn't what's in the box. That's obviously valuable. The value is the architecture of the underlying pieces and how we've modeled it so that it can be extensible, and then anyone can expand it to do what it is, teach it to do what they want it to do for their needs. So,
okay. So just to like, a question as you're saying that, missing the value prop here. If I need to make the effort to get Aspire projects working for local development, but my higher environment doesn't use it, or I have to do something else. But from what you're saying, it sounds like, number one, you do very little work locally to like light up Aspire. And then when you deploy it, you have all that information there that can be, you can create bicep, or you can create, like you said, Aspirate, or you can like you can automate the creation of your deployment artifacts.
Or you can choose not to. So, the question here is a very good one, because there's value that you can get out of Aspire just for the development story. And you've already got an existing application. You've got an existing deployment infrastructure. You may have a whole team that just does like DevOps type stuff, or platform engineering, or whatever you subscribe to. And they're not going to like change that for some new thing that we just, that's fine. Like just absorb and use the bits of Aspire that help you on a day-to-day. You don't have to go and use the app host information and reauthor your entire deployment pipeline if you don't want to. That's totally fine. Just keep deploying the apps that you have the way that you're already doing it. That's totally reasonable. The full end-to-end, the full value prop of Aspire is realized when you go and deploy to somewhere that we have integration for. Azure, AWS, Kubernetes through Aspirate, Docker Compose. Like if you were landing on one of those places, then Aspire has a really great story for you, because you can define all that stuff in C#, run a couple of tools, and it'll do it all, right? But you don't have to do that, because there is value in the pieces, the 5 things that Fowler said before. You can just use 3 of them. You can just deploy the dashboard and use nothing else, and just deploy the dashboard as an OTel viewer. And we know people are doing that already. There's blog posts about it. There's videos about it, because it turns out there hasn't to date been a really easy, feature-rich OTel viewer in a container. Like that doesn't exist. People are like, oh, use Prometheus and Grafana. Or like, okay, well, now I have to go and set up Prometheus and Grafana. And Grafana doesn't come with a dashboard. You have to author it. You have to learn how to query. Like, it's a whole thing, right? Like, so that has value. And so I would encourage folks yes, it's a little to unpack. There's a lot here, but if you take the time, use it, understand these layers, I think it'll become very evident what parts will give you value. Oh, I can totally integrate these 3 things. You know, the deployment stuff, maybe not so much now because that's a longer lead thing. But I could totally integrate these 3 things with not much work and get huge value out of them for my development story.
Okay.
Oh,
Yeah, I think, yeah. I think the thing too is like, just agreed on what you're saying. Like going through a quick start was really helpful to me to get a feel for, oh my gosh, there's so little code. Like it's so little work to light up Aspire. You know what I mean? It's not like a big investment at all. So if I spend 10, 15 minutes turning on Aspire for my app and my dev experience is like 50 times better, that's plenty. That's all I need. You know what I mean? That's a great start if that's all I get out of it. So,
and I think it's similar to anything. Like people have heard of things like test containers, which is a big project that it creates libraries for programmatically defining and creating container instances for testing, right? And there are libraries for various things. Adopting that, the value of that is fairly obvious, but it's not free. Like you have to go and do the work to get the value out of it, right? And it's no different from any new thing. If you looked at benchmark.net, you go, well, we were already doing benchmarks. We rolled our own thing. That's great. Benchmark.net, though, exists and is now the gold standard for authoring tests for doing profiling and benchmarking of .NET stuff. So there's a cost associated with adopting it, but there's all this value that you get that continues to snowball because that thing is supported, it continues to evolve, it continues to improve, it has a community behind it. This is no different. Like this is just like anything else that comes along that purports to add value. We can't answer in 3 seconds, 10 minutes often whether it's right for you. It's something you have to go and assess for yourself. And I admit it's something we're still working on, how to impart what we think is valuable about Aspire in the shortest amount of time possible so that people can make a decision about whether they go invest time to use it. Because we know that that's, day to day, you have to make decisions about, do I go and spend 30 minutes right now to go and learn a little bit more about this to determine whether it's something I should look at.
Yeah, I like I like this take here. Like great for local dev story. They're already set up with the deployment pipeline with GitHub Actions, just using local dev. That's selling point enough for me. Like I do love the integration with like AZD and Bicep and deploying to all the other, but like don't get hung up on that as like,
no, exactly.
Yeah.
So
yeah, that's great. 2
things I want to mention. So there was a really good question about, so why not Docker Compose plus the dashboard? You can totally, like, no one is gonna like say you should or shouldn't do that. The reason why I think Aspire is better than Compose, even for local dev scenarios, is because of the removal of ports, connection strings, and configuration, and the possibility for you to model and abstract a set of resources and share things via packages. That today, as far as I know, isn't possible via Compose. Compose files have a very rudimentary way of kind of composing values across multiple files by doing environment variable replacements and tokenization. Code lets you do much richer modeling, right? You can use inheritance, you can use composition. You just get a lot more tools to be able to abstract things. So let's say you were a team that provided infra for your devs and you want to say, we're going to standardize on Prometheus, Grafana, and like that stack for observability. You can build a package that targets Aspire hosting that encapsulates all those resources in a single package that everyone installs into their app hosts. And now you call add our default telemetry system, and it just does the right thing, right? So you get a chance to programmatically enhance their dev experience, and you can encapsulate all that information without them having to copy and paste Compose files, because that's today the state of the art is copy and pasting Compose files and sharing those across teams, right? So this gives you a way to kind of like do more without having devs understand those things, right?
So we're getting slightly short on time here. We can probably go another 10, 15 minutes if you want, but I'm realizing you showed Hello World, the very basic Hello World. It might be good to show something that's got a few more resources in it, because to me that really lit up when I
show
saw
Aspire Shop.
I'll pull
I
up.
think Aspire Shop is the good.
Even worse, I'll pull up like the main repo and open up the.
Oh, don't pull up. I'm specifically not saying test shop because
which
that
is horrific, right?
Fine, whatever.
Because it's like, actually, you know what? let me.
You don't have the samples cloned. You have the samples cloned.
I do.
Good.
I had to
Aspire Shop is much more manageable.
Because like you said, programmatically being able to like with IntelliSense say like, I want to use this Redis resource from within this client app. All right, no YAML. It just like lights up. It's such a smooth experience there.
So we have a samples repository. I think this is up to date. Let's see. Yep. All right, Aspire Shop. We have this sample. Oh my gosh. What? Open the solution, please. So the Aspire Shop is a mini version of eShop that just has a couple of projects.
Mm-hmm.
And here's the app host. And it has Postgres with a volume. If you've ever had to do this kind of stuff in Compose, it's not as though it's impossible, but it's for me personally, it's a thing that never sticks. I have to remember what the ports are for every database, for every container, and then you have to kind of map them together. So you're doing this thing where you have to recall the config information for each container you want to use, and then you have to connect the dots by having them warp together. So the thing that I think Aspire does, or one of its pluses, is you don't have to know the ports or config information. That's baked into the definition of a resource. So you're authoring a Postgres resource, and this is one thing I want to show. Like, you're authoring this resource. The thing Damian said is super important. Don't focus on what's built in. Focus on the model. Like, look at how the Postgres resource is built and build your own for your containers, right? If you want to extend it, change it, modify it, it's not magic. Look at the code, go see what it's doing, and then do your own version of it, right? But the Postgres resource has built into it. I understand Postgres. I understand it has these environment variables for settings. It uses these ports for listening on. So when I offer up Postgres to consumers, they don't have to know the port. All they have to know is when they call, like, add Postgres with volume, add database, it knows the volume is like this. The
path. Like, it knows the path, the Postgres
right?
wants in the container,
you don't have to know what the volume is. All you care about is persist my data, right? Persist it and have it work. And then you grab the database and you say with reference, that will give me a connection string with the name, catalog DB, and my app can consume. So, like, even though this looks a little magical, it's doing very basic things under the covers. So
the other thing I'll point out about the samples repo is often the samples repo becomes the testing ground for creating new features. So line 3, you'll see it says builder.create stable password. That's not an Aspire feature. That doesn't exist in Aspire. Yeah. I created that in this sample because I wanted this project to work a specific way. And then that is that once you use a data volume with a database container, most of them you have to have a stable password, because what happens is it initializes itself using the password that you set up on the first run, and now
then you need to connect.
That data is persistent in the volume. The next time the container starts with that volume, if the password changes, like, everything breaks, because it's like, well, I have a database here, it has a user with this name, but you gave me a different password, and things fail. So you have to create a stable password. So I created an extension just in this repo that creates stable passwords built on top of the parameter primitive in Aspire and the concept of parameter default value generators. Like, that's a thing that the parameter system knows about. So I just extended that and hooked it into user secrets, which is a .NET thing. So that the first time it runs, it generates a password, which is what our parameters know how to do already. And then it stores it in user secrets, so that the next time it runs, it checks to see if you have it already. And if you do, it uses it. That will become a feature. We will just turn that into a feature, but I wrote it in here first. And that is critical to us validating that we've built the extensibility model correctly. Like, have we modeled enough things so that someone who is not in the Aspire source code can add features to Aspire effectively, right? And again, as framework designers, That's the type of thing that we have to think about. So a lot of the samples include stuff like this. It's not just using the stuff built into Aspire. It's examples of extending Aspire because it's just .NET code. Like just use the app model, extend it with nice extension methods and whatnot so that you get a nice developer experience.
I think one thing that I mistakenly assumed, and other people I've showed this to have mistakenly assumed, you see this code and you're like, cool, but I'm sure there's a config file that has all these settings in order to configure Redis and configure all this stuff. It's like, no, this is literally it. You write 3 lines of code and you have a Postgres database.
Add Redis Commander. Yeah, add Commander there, Fowler.
Is there?
Oh, you already got it. Sorry, you got Commander. Add PG admin.
Like that's it.
So do you know how much work it? Okay, just like for fun, do you know how much work it is to configure PG admin in Compose? And can you do it by heart? Like it is non-trivial to figure out what you're supposed to set up. Like you have to go read the docs every single time. Yeah. And what you want is for one person to spend hours figuring out all the hard stuff, encapsulating it in a package, and then having others consume it. I think that is kind of the key thing that is different about.
That's what makes an ecosystem, right?
Yeah.
Like, right. Rather than just sample repos full of source code everywhere that you have to know how to find and copy paste a million times.
I saw in the latest in Preview 5, like for instance, RabbitMQ added in the RabbitMQ dashboard, right?
Yeah,
so
I added that.
Yeah,
Damian
added.
Some magical person. So I love that, right? You just do dot, and then I've got like a dashboard for local dev, and
right. And that one was the same consumption pattern, but the way we implemented it was different because the RabbitMQ one isn't another container that attaches to the primary one. It's actually one image, and you have to change the underlying image tag in order to get the Rabbit one with the UI. So that was a new pattern that we had to figure out. How do we implement that so that it's kind of safe to consume the same way that the other ones are modeled? So that was a little bit of work, but it's logic. Like we just had to like write the code and make it kind of feel correct. Another example that we haven't done yet, but we do have very early plans on how to do. People may have noticed that in Aspire Preview 5, everything became HTTPS by default. And so we did a big security review and all the things, and we're like, yeah, we need to, because we've got multiple things talking to each other, and they share privileged information, like environment variables and like things like that often hold secrets. The decision was made that even in local development, that stuff has to be protected because most OSs are multi-machine, multi-user. You can have a different user logged in or just a process that's running at a lower privilege than you. And so you have to ensure that you're not leaking information across boundaries in a way that can be scanned over the network. And so we added HTTPS by default. But containers like the Redis container, the Postgres container, the RabbitMQ container, they don't run over HTTPS by default because like what certificate would they use? Like HTTPS has infrastructure that's required to make it work. But we have plans to actually automate all of that stuff in the future too. So that because ASP.NET Core has a development certificate sort of set of features, the ASP.NET Core Dev Cert, we plan to extend that hopefully in .NET 9 so that we can issue more certs, like ephemeral certs that only live as long as the container is running or your application is running, and we issue them to you run, and then we inject them into the container because all of those containers support configuring HTTPS by just giving it all the certs. They have like 7 environment variables that you set and a bind mount that you set for the PFX file or the cert file and the key file. If you do all of that, then they will work with a self-signed certificate locally. But to Fowler's point, no one could remember all that stuff by default. Like it's not secure by default. If you want to make it secure, you have to go and read reams of documentation and futz around with HBS certificate creation and all the stuff about self-signed certs. Like that is so much work. We could just do all that for you by default. Just make it work like securely. So those are the type of things that we can do once all this stuff is wired together.
So this is awesome. And somebody asked the question like, it's just there, right? So
yep, it's there now.
That took me 5 minutes, right? I could do it 5 times in any new project without copying and pasting a bunch of garbage and changing it. I can get IntelliSense for like overload resolution. Like using code is a super nice thing. I think that the thing we struggled with in the very beginning was, should we use like config based? Should it be code based? Code unlocked a lot of these features, like just by the nature of how it is, right?
Yeah. Yep. And like you said, not having to look up the ports, not having to read the docs, not having to figure out why isn't it connecting. Oh, I didn't set that connection. It's like, oh, okay. There was one other question I think would be good to like kind of as we get to wrapping up. There's a question about like, could I actually really like deploy something in? Yeah, here it is. Is it realistic to create a new project and deploy it in 5 minutes?
Yes.
Less than 5 minutes.
You can do a Spire starter application. You can even tick the Redis box to have a Redis cache, and you can deploy that using AZD to Azure Container Apps. You should be able to do that in less than 5 minutes.
And so, like,
where it gets tricky is databases. Once you have a database, standing up new database services or running databases inside your own container in container paths often has implications that mean that it takes longer than 5 minutes. But Redis, like running in your own container in ACA, trivial.
I think to show one thing about deployment and what Damian said earlier, where you can use Aspire in a way where, you know, I have my deployment engine already. I don't want to change how I do deployment or CI/CD or anything. That's a fine stance to take. If you choose though to swallow if you take the red pill,
you take the red pill
and you go all the way down the Aspire rabbit hole, where you benefit is commands like this one, AZD %. Let's say you want to get into Azure, right? You have no idea how to start. You don't understand the auth model. You don't understand how anything really works, but you want to like get going so you can see it working, and then you can decide to peel the onion when you want to, right? So that one of the big things about Aspire is you can get into a working state really fast, and then you can decide, okay, now I want to figure out how it works. Let me figure out what it's doing under the covers, and that's a fine thing to do, right? We don't block you by telling you have to learn about these 10 things first before you understand anything up here. That is, I think, philosophically not how we think about software. We're like 5 minutes to wow, and then built with a sound design such that you can kind of peel it back and go, okay, I see it's doing these 4 things. If I want to do thing 5, all I have to do is X, right? Versus
that smooth ramp, right?
Yeah,
you want to be able to like
ramp.
Yeah,
we talk about progressive disclosure a lot. Like it's probably an overused meme now in any type of UX design, but it's an axiom that holds true, right? Like whenever you're doing any type of user experience design, which building development frameworks, libraries, tools is absolutely a user experience design problem. Or certainly that's a large part of it. We don't want to throw everything at your face. Like that's why C# changed to having top level statements by default, because we had evidence where you would try to teach someone C# and you're just trying to get them to do console.writeline hello world. And the nature of it was that if they go, okay, the empty project has a file with 12 lines in it that do nothing. They have to be there, but I type console.writeline. Why do I have to put it here? Why does it have to be in this thing that says main? What does internal mean? Why do I have to have all these braces? Why have I got these using things? What does that do? It's like, oh, don't worry about that yet. We'll teach you that later. You know what? It's easier if we just remove all that stuff and then just let you learn about that stuff when you have to learn about it. That is absolutely what we're trying to do now when we think through a lot of these things. And it's trade-offs. Don't get me wrong. It's not a silver bullet. Like we often have to make painful decisions which tip one way rather than another. But that's the core principle that we're trying to do here.
Okay.
So last demo is this feature that no one should use, but just to show you kind of how the guts work. when you run, because we have this rich model of information in the app host, different tools can interrogate that model to do super interesting things, right? So when you're going to Azure, I can run something like AZD %, which will essentially spit out the bicep required to deploy this project, right? So assuming you swallowed all the pills and you're like down the rabbit hole, you get, let me open VS Code. It's better opening big folders. Same. I trust myself. Here's this folder, infra, and it has this resources.bicep file. This is all the goop created to deploy that project, right? Plus this where's the manifest folder? Oh wait, this one. Plus here's the container app deployment, the container app definition for this app. Now imagine you want to just like do a simple hello world to get this app running in Azure. Like I have to go learn bicep or arm JSON or YAML, get the AZ, the Azure CLI, get all these things wired up, understand auth, understand how to connect multiple services together. We can just give you a set of defaults that work really well. And then you can decide to peel the onion and go, okay, I want to change X, Y, and Z. Here's how it works, right? And what we're trying to build is a system where you don't ever have to like go here. You just change your C# code and it will impact that code, right? So if I have one project, two projects, a Redis, a RabbitMQ, example, like go Copilot. That's not right, but it's almost right. Like RabbitMQ, and then let me do with reference Rabbit. We understand things like this project needs to talk to this service. We could do insane things like have a secure config that spits out like a virtual network and a private link and super secures the network. So the more we understand about how your app is modeled, we can do a lot more in now and in the future, right? So if I like redo in %.
So it's understanding what's in your app builder and it's able to update that.
So here I said with reference RabbitMQ, and I get this secret that has a RabbitMQ with a password, right? And I get this environment variable that points to a secret. By default, I didn't do anything. I didn't have to configure a key. I didn't have to do any magic. It just did that for you because you didn't say you wanted all those things. All you said was A talks to B, and the definition of RabbitMQ has a secret parameter, so it knew to put it in a secret. So there's all these like higher level things we can kind of generate and compile as a result. Here's the definition of the RabbitMQ container, right? Like here it is in bicep. So we translate a container resource into a container app resource with the right information. The password is here. The password comes from a parameter. It's a compiler. Like I didn't want to say it, but it's a compiler. We have this model. We walk the tree, and then we can spit out like bicep, right? As an example. And this is one incantation or one instantiation of like trying to spit out the model. There's the manifest, there's bicep, there'll be like CloudFormation, there'll be Terraform. Like what we want is for you all to help us kind of build out the model. We don't want this to all be in the box. There should be a Terraform package and a package for like Kubernetes stuff for like that's the what we want to build is that system, right? Of plugins and components and resources that run at dev time, at tool generation time to spit out the manifest or whatever. That is what I think will make Aspire great. Not just kind of like, can I do X in the box? Well, maybe you can, but maybe you can build it. Maybe you can add a package that for your environment does this something insane thing. I started to build this prototype doing app building where you can run Aspire in your deployed environment, but all it does is it has the dashboard running and each of your apps kind of report themselves to a server that the dashboard sees. So it's not orchestration. Maybe you're in IIS or running in Windows services or systemd services, but each of your apps is saying, I'm alive kind of thing, right? To report status. As an example to show like this system is flexible. It's not just what we shipped.
Okay. Wow. Well, this was amazing. I think we're at time.
Should do this every week. I think there's enough questions on Aspire.
Yeah, I think we should maybe come back every week until we ship. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, you're welcome back anytime. So is there any like, I don't know, call to action, whatever? Where do we send people these days?
Yes. Please. .net. That's not how you spell .net. Please go to our docs, .net Aspire docs. We'll put it in the thing, and just start using it. Like this is our doc page for Aspire. Wait, this is not for Aspire. This is for everything. Where is the Aspire one? Is there?
You were there.
This
so
thing.
There's the Aspire. What's new? Yeah.
This thing.
Oh yeah. The
go here, and just start playing with it. All we really want is for you to play with it, and then give us feedback. I think a lot of ideas will start to flow as a result of y'all jumping in and playing with it. And join our Discord channel.
And remember the samples repo. Like make sure because there's lots of good examples of extensibility. A lot of the big questions, can I use it with Node? Can I do it with this database? A lot of that stuff's answered in the samples repo. There's just like
definitely. I'll put the Aspire Discord in the
Cool.
chat. Definitely join there, and people are using it in there, and they're having really interesting discussions. So I think that's a good place to join too.
I like highly recommend go through like in this doc, go through one of the quick starts. Like literally you can go through these in like 10, 15 minutes for some of them. And you can immediately like a lot of demos that Microsoft shows are like there's hand waving and magic behind the scenes. These are literally like you will be blown away at how fast, like how simple things are. So cool. All right. Well, yeah, this was awesome. We're at time. Definitely like let's line up another one because there were still more questions coming in
Yeah.
and more stuff to show.
Awesome.
So
Yeah.
wonderful. Okay, I'll play the happy music. Thanks.